So business entity. You ready for this one that neither of us are really super comfortable with?
I hope it gives people peace of mind that, like, you don't really have to know what you're doing here. It'll be okay.
Yeah, yeah. And frankly, I think I'm starting the episode with me asking you that question because that just shows people like, hey, we're not entirely sure. So this topic that Lauren and I are starting off this series with, whether or not we release it in this order, who knows? But business entity. You did this before me, and just remind people like how long have you been doing this for?
9 years now, just celebrated my ninth anniversary.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. March will be my third anniversary.
It's a big
People may or may not.
accomplishment.
Hey, but 9 years, and look, I launched post-pandemic, and so there were way more resources available to me than 9 years ago for you. So, like, where did you go? Like, how did you figure out, like, what entity? I'm gonna start a law firm, and you did it right out of law school, so, like, what do
Did
you
I
do?
was crazy. I Googled it, to be quite honest, and I feel like I fretted over it a lot more than looking back I probably needed to, but there weren't a lot of resources. So I just Googled what the options are, and an LLC seemed closest to what I was looking for. I wanted to have an actual entity, so I went with that. What was your plan? Did you have any more of a plan than I did?
So, I was leaving a firm that because I worked at law firms. I worked at including when I was a law clerk, I worked at 4 law firms before starting my own practice. And I'm pretty sure all with the exception of one that was a professional limited liability company, the rest were LLCs. And so I was like, "Well, hey, if they could do it, if they could
How
have an
hard could it be?
LLC, it must be allowed," is like what I thought too. Because lawyer brain kicks in and you're like, "I gotta read every regulation about law firms." Like, then I'll be able to make the decision, which is don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. Not when you're starting a practice. Uh, so yeah, I was like, "Well, if they could do it, I could do it." And I did for the Illinois Supreme Court, which I don't know how it is in Colorado, but in Illinois, our Supreme Court is like the governing body of law firms, not a bar association. And so their website, I did find, had tons of FAQs in general. Now, they don't make it easy, obviously, but I did find something in there that said, oh, yes, we do permit LLCs, but then these other regulations apply to that.
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty smart. Now I'm like, "Oh, shoot, should I go back and look?" 9 years in, hopefully I'm alright. But that would be a good place to start is your governing body. I don't remember what Colorado has. I remember being slightly confused about the limited liability partnership, and also I was like, "It's just me." So partnership seems to be overkill. So the LLC kind of worked, and all of the sort of S corp formal corporations also seem to be overkill. So I think I picked it by delineation, just this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this one does. But yeah, definitely checking with your regulatory board is probably a good idea that I didn't
Y-
do.
Look, it's one of these things where we're lawyers, we could figure it out, even though we sometimes know better and we should be like, should I consult a business lawyer? Like when I'm starting this business? But going to the heart of like how you and I charge for our services with a known fee, I was like, I don't want to do that because I don't know how much it's going to cost. And I'm budgeting for starting a business.
Yeah, that budget is teeny tiny in the beginning. So Google is a good friend and use your best judgment. Like you said, we're attorneys, we have good education, we know how to think. If something is giving you the icks or raises a red flag, then certainly avoid that. But if it's just more of I don't know, I don't know if I'm doing this perfectly, then that's not a reason to not do it.
And I might want to just do this right now, totally on the fly. Is if I were starting today and I didn't know and I wasn't listening to this podcast, I would be thinking, like, I'll use Perplexity, right? Like, I'll ask Perplexity, okay, I'm a lawyer. I live in X jurisdiction, and I want to start a law firm. Please provide the steps in 2024 or 2025 of what I need to do and what type of entities are allowed. Maybe that's too many questions. Maybe I would just start with the entity.
Yeah, no, that would be very interesting. I think that just the fact that we have so many more resources, you're absolutely right. Nearly a decade ago, I really felt like I was on a desert island. But there are so many things now that even if they're not perfectly right, they're going to get you going in the right direction. And yeah, Perplexity might be a great option to try it out and see what it tells you.
Yeah, and another thing I remember thinking about was something that because I was doing a little bit of business law at the time. Like, I've taken so many CLEs and, like, learned in practice about business law since then, in particular with limited liability companies in Illinois. but I was working with some small business owners, and I was interfacing with their uh, financial advisors, CPAs, accountants as well. And I did, and then like networking with other freelancers who are really solopreneurs, of which I still am, right? Um, I learned about this idea of the single member LLC in Illinois and the different ways that it could be taxed. There's pass through taxation where you could pay yourself a salary, and then there's a corporate tax, and then there's the tax on what you make, and it's different. And so we're not accountants or CPAs here, so we're not going to get into
Yeah.
those details. And S corp treatment is, I think, is what it's called. So I did know that going into it. Like once I learned, okay, LLC, that's doable for my state. And then you see when you're registering it, okay, what are the options? Well, I could register it as single member. I could register it as pass through. I could register it as S corp. What the heck does all that mean? But I already had a sense of that. And then I searched for that too. And at the time, I was still using Google because it was before Gen AI hit the scene. So I was Googling that stuff too to figure out, okay, yeah, for me at the time, I didn't know what my revenue was going to be. Pass through taxation and just single member LLC is what I ultimately went with. Like is Colorado similar with that?
Yes, from my understanding, and again, this is not my expertise, but I would say for the first probably 4 or 5 years of the practice, I was just a single member pass through. I got taxed on the back end. And then I hit that threshold point probably around year 5 or 6 where my tax accountant said, "Hey, if your revenue trends in this direction, next year we may need to make this S corp election just because it's going to be better for you in terms of taxes. You're going to hit that tipping point." And sure enough, probably around year 6, that's exactly what happened. And from there on, I've made that kind of S corp election. It's a more for me in terms of what I have to deal with taxes. It's not just I hand everything to my tax accountant. He does it. I do have to make the estimated payments and monthly payments. Not it's not terrible once you learn it, but yeah, there is that sort of tax component to it that I think working with a professional to get a sense of where you're at and what you need is really going to be helpful.
Uh, so really important takeaway there. Learn that we both have accountants. Like
Yeah.
we're not doing our own taxes.
Yeah, that's one of the very few areas of the practice that I will not do. I will pay the taxes, but they told me what to pay and when to pay it. I will do that part, but I will not figure out what needs to be taxed or what the number is. I have always outsourced that because that just freaks me out and I don't want to get that wrong.
Yeah, yeah. And look, I was a TurboTax person until I was starting my business. And once I started my business, said, okay, like I have to, I gotta outsource this. There's too many other, like you said, I'm wearing too many other hats as a small business owner. Doing my own taxes can now not be part of that.
Yeah, and I think you can find someone reasonable. I was always a DIY. I did TurboTax too, but my accountant, it's a few $100s a year. I want to say maybe a little bit more now with the S corp, but for the peace of mind it gives me that I can just hand him my records, which he always, I will pat myself on the back, gives me a compliment that they're very organized. So make it easy on your tax professional. Keep organized records. But it's so nice to just have him take care of it and just tell me you're paying the right amount, you're paying too little, you're paying too much. I will adjust, but I don't wanna be in those weeds at all.
So you let me know if you want me to take this part out. And just so folks know, like we're trying to do this as off the cuff as possible because I think it's really important that you learn from who we really are and like what our real experience was like. So you let me know if you want me to take this out. But how about personal side of things? Because what I've done, and I'll share first then, is like I talked about it with my wife. Obviously, I'm not just gonna make my own decisions on my own. Yes, as a single member LLC, I'm in charge, but my boss is my spouse. And so we're just going to move all of our taxes over to whatever accountant is now taking care of the business side of things too. That's what we decided to do. And I actually started 2 LLCs. As longtime listeners know, or if you actually read my podcast logo, you'll see this is a Kerbis verse LLC production. Like I have another legal entity, right? So I actually have 2 legal entities in my personal taxes, and my wife is a traditional W-2 employee. So it was going to be way too complicated for me. So talked about it with my wife. We're like, yes, we're just going to pay whatever we have to pay to not have to worry about it and make sure we're paying everything we owe. Thing. So we totally combined. We use the same CPA firm for everything. It's a small local CPA firm. Are you doing like what was your decision process like with all that?
Yeah, it was similar. When we moved out to Colorado, right after I finished law school, took the bar out here and had that first year of the business, just a few months in 2015. My husband also had his own business. Yes, we got in that like TurboTax is not meeting our needs anymore. We need somebody to help us. I have had several businesses. I don't think I've actually ever only had one business now that I think back. I've always had at least two. He has his own. He had one with partners before, then he was back on his own. So yes, it's way above my pay grade. Like this is not my wheelhouse. So we do as a unit also use that same CPA and they just handle everything. So it does help. And even if you, like you said, you have someone who's just a traditional W-2 employee, that's certainly easier, but it's nice to have one person take care of all of it.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Another thing I'm assuming people are gonna, like, wonder and by the way, I publish this via Substack, powers the back end of Law Subscribe. So, like, comment in the Substack or message me on LinkedIn, or I'm sure Lauren, you too, if you have any questions. Maybe we do a version of something like this live, so we get, like, live questions. Um, but I would love for this to be as interactive as possible, more so than just an interview-based format like the show has traditionally been for me. And you've actually done, Lauren, actually, like, takeaway shows. You don't just do interviews. So this is new for me. This is less new for you, right?
Yes, I do have a mix of me just talking and then me talking with folks.
Yeah, yeah, so I don't really do the just talking thing. So anyway, new for me, not new for you, but I think this format lends itself so well to, like, audience participation. So listeners, like, reach out to us. Let us know what you wanna hear if you have questions about this. But I'm just gonna guess that you might wonder, "Okay, you've convinced me. Like, I gotta talk to a CPA or an accountant before setting up my entity. That's a thing we gotta think about. How do I find one?" It's like a lot like, "How do I find a lawyer?" Like,
Y
it's kinda similar.
It's
So, like,
very similar.
what'd you
Yes.
do? What did you do?
I went to my trusty old pal Google. I mean, to be honest with you, Google got me into this profession to begin with, so I'm not gonna stray too far. But yeah, but it was just kind of down the street, and I think I looked at the reviews, and it was just they took an approach that was very hands-on, very personal, and we just kind of liked the feeling of it. We thought, worst case, we can use them 1 year, and if we don't like it or we just don't get a good vibe, we'll go to someone else. I mean, it's not something you have to keep an ongoing relationship with. But we just really liked who we found. We stumbled on him. I've referred him to so many people at this point. I wonder one day if he's gonna be like, "We're too busy, to help you anymore," but hopefully we're in there for the long haul. But yeah, really just, like, asking around, and I don't know, Matthew, if you asked other folks, but certainly if you know any other lawyers or professionals who run their own business, sometimes they have really good recommendations.
Oh, yeah, that's excellent. And also, I'm sure I'm sure the CPA firm I use could probably do anybody. They're based in Illinois, so maybe they're accustomed to just doing federal and state taxes in Illinois, but it's a federal thing. So I got to imagine. Reach out to me and Lauren, and we could probably recommend our accountants. The way I started was I asked my dad, actually. I'm like, "Who does your and mom's taxes?" Like, I'm sure you're outsourcing it. And he's like, "Yeah." And he's, I'll introduce you." And so that accountant was not really taking on anybody else at the time, but because he had been helping my dad for decades, he was like, "Yes, I will help your son, like, with the taxes, at least for the first year." And then not long after that, after that first year, the firm he was with, like, sold to a larger firm. And I used them for one more time, and then that firm sold to an even larger firm. And as you can imagine, they increased their prices every time. So I said, "I'm gonna start shopping around." Well, as a business that even though, like, virtual law firm here, right? Like, I can help anyone in Illinois. My business is inherently local. Like, I'm super involved with the local chamber of commerce, like nonprofit boards and whatever. If you're thinking about becoming a law firm owner and you're just trying to figure out your entity, like, eventually, spoiler alert for future content, you're gonna have to get business. And, like, joining a local chamber of commerce might be one of those ways to get business. And what I have found is the best way to get business strategically and when you actually need it, if you hire the services of somebody in the chamber, they will thank you at a meeting and everybody knows, wow, he's using people and they're a good relationship or whatever. And talk to the most like the CPA firms, they have somebody there who comes to these meetings and they're at every single meeting. Other people in the chamber have hired this firm and he continues to show up, which must mean the firm's doing a good job. And so we had a one-on-one meeting and I hired him. And we've also been able to refer business to each other. And I have some clients that needed a new CPA. I sent them to this firm and they historically do some work with lawyers. They even have a lawyer in house. But since I'm positioned in the market for like down market, when they're too expensive for the legal stuff or the other attorneys they've typically referred things to, they refer those clients to me. And so it's actually become really beneficial. So if you could find a CPA that's in a similar market as you at these networking events, like I've been super happy and I'm paying more. Like I am still paying more. But they're also able to help. What's nice about to have a firm instead of just a person, what I found is I'm actually able to get some really great tax planning in addition to just taxes at the end. And that's a whole other conversation. But you do have to think about how you want to be taxed in the beginning when setting up your LLC, which is why I think it's important we've been talking about it.
Yeah, and I think even for, like, retirement planning, which, yes, is a whole can of worms, but is something for us as solopreneurs to think about, right? Because our employer is not taking money out automatically. We have to do that, and if we aren't intentional about it or planning for it, then you could go years and years where it's not happening, and maybe in the beginning, it can't happen because revenue's not quite there yet, but you do wanna be, I think, thinking about that from the beginning, and if you can set it up where you're putting even a little bit away, like, in the long run, that's gonna pay so much in terms of dividends for you, but being able to work with somebody who can help you say, okay, I need to figure out the taxes for my business. So I'm paying the IRS what I need to pay, but also, what does this look like long term? That's a mutually beneficial relationship. And finding somebody, you'll keep them for life, I think, once you find the right person.
What you just said is also it just reminded me something about the entity that you pick, and that is also how do you pay yourself? Because that was also something I didn't know. Okay, do I just transfer money from one account to another account? And talking about like setting up a bank, like you have to form once the LLC is formed, you got to get an EIN, and then you got to open a bank account, and you need your articles of incorporation to show the bank, and you may or may not need your EIN. And then, okay, now you have a bank account. What types of bank accounts do you set up? You got to set up at least an operating account. I'd suggest you set up a savings account too. And then also you got to set up maybe an IOLTA account. I didn't set one up for the first year because I didn't need it until I anticipated needing it. And then I set up the IOLTA account. Good luck setting up an IOLTA account with a bank because they almost never do it. Like they literally
Same.
pulled out like a binder and they had to flip through a binder. It wasn't even in like the digital materials. That's how infrequent they have to set up IOLTA, a lawyer trust fund account.
Yeah, I had to have a manager. I think I was talking to just the general guy. He was like, "Great, I could set up a business checking." And I said, "And I also need this trust account." And he looked at me like, "I'm sorry, a what?" Let me go get my manager, and then I had to explain it to them, and I went to Chase, like, I went to a national it wasn't like a local credit union where maybe I could have understood. Even they were like, "I'm sorry, what account?" So, yes, you do be prepared that you may get some deer in the headlights looks for those trust accounts.
Yeah, yeah, and so I'm curious to know because now you have the S corp election. Like, what was it like figuring out like how to pay yourself when you were not that when you were pass through? And I want to talk about like mechanics. Like, we'll get into like how much should I pay myself like next, right? Like the mechanics of paying yourself as pass through, and then what it's like to transition to S corp and paying yourself that way, and are you using, like, an ADP or a Gusto or, like, some way to formally pay yourself? Like, I'm genuinely curious to know.
Yeah, I will be honest, thinking back to when it was just a pass through, I don't quite remember. I do remember I always had like a budget. Like I would pay myself X amount and I don't remember what it was back then, but it functioned in the same way as a salary. So I wasn't like I'll just pull money out when I need it because I knew that approach could probably get me into trouble quite quickly. I wanted to say, okay, I'll pull out $3,000, whatever it was. And that was what I would move from my operating account into my personal bank account. So I was always very sure not to mix personal and business. Like I wouldn't charge my groceries on my business credit card. I always moved the money out, but I would just have a set amount. And then when I made the S corp election, I really leaned on my CPA to say what should I do in terms of my quote unquote salary. So I have that amount that I pay myself once a month comes out. I don't use Gusto, I use Wave Accounting, which I know too, Mathew, and so that kind of quote unquote, "runs" my payroll, which is me clicking a button. It feels very odd because it's approve the payroll for yourself, like, I don't have any employees, but alright, I'll go through these hoops. So that comes out once a month, and then I make an owner's distribution once a month, but also for a set amount. I don't know, do you have a set amount that you use, or does it fluctuate by month?
So like you said, it took you 4 to 5 years to know what you could comfortably pay yourself as a salary, because that's the distinction between pass-through and S corp. Like, you have to pay yourself keyword here, lawyers, you're gonna know this one, a reasonable salary. right? So
Favorite words.
whatever that means in light of your context, consult a expert in that to know what that is, such as a CPA. And so I'm still pass through right now. I'm thinking about 2025, but 2026 for sure. And one
So
of the
with
benefits
your
go ahead.
with the pass through, do you do it like a set amount per month? Like you almost it's not technically a salary, but you still have an amount, or do you just base it on the revenue that comes in? And are there I would imagine there are some challenges with that because that's not always even.
Absolutely, and this is one of the benefits of the subscription model because you got that recurring revenue, which makes it easier to predict your revenue and what you can pay yourself versus what your expenses are for the month.
So
So
smart.
yeah, and yes, really to the first question, which was I pay myself a set amount every month. Since I'm not an S corp, I'm just playing pretend S corp right now. So so I'm not taking like an additional withdrawal or like an owner withdrawal on top of that. I'm just paying myself a set amount every month and I want to commit to that. And everybody does it differently, but I'm trying to build up a war chest. Like I'm trying to build up like a huge savings because anything could happen. Like a business savings, not a personal savings. Trying to build that up too. I want to be able to pay myself if all my clients unsubscribe tomorrow. Sure hope that doesn't happen. I could continue to pay myself for 6 months right now, what I've been paying myself, because I'm putting away 50% and I'm only paying myself 50% of the anticipated revenue. When I have like another client who subscribes, or I have a client who like wants to do things a la carte outside of a subscription, or I'm getting more of that fixed fee, I'm actually paying myself less than 50% of what I've brought in that month. And so I just try to keep it the same exact amount to like be disciplined about it. And I was not able to do that for the first year. Like the whole first year, I would not pay myself some months just trying to build up that war chest so that I could eventually start to pay myself. And so I think it was like 5 or 6 times I actually took out some money from my business to pay myself in that first year, which is still closer to home for me. Um, and then it wasn't really until the second year where I was like, okay, like I've significantly increased the clients that are signed on. I've more than tripled my revenue. I think I can start to pay myself a fixed amount every month. And so that's the route that I've taken. So it's good to know that Wave Accounting lets you do that. I had no idea I could just do it in a system that I already have, which is super valuable to know. Okay, so even if nobody listens to this, Lauren, thank you. I learned something.
You've learned. Yes, and it's so tricky. That first year in particular, I think that's common for most folks. I don't remember, but I would not be surprised if there were months that I didn't make anything. And I always tell folks, you've gotta have some sort of personal savings coming in. If you can do it for a year where you can at least live off of that, then that is critical. Because if you go in thinking, "I gotta make that amount, $10,000 in month 1 in this brand new business," like, that likely is not going to happen unless you have set up some serious connections, you're bringing clients over, whatever it is. But if you're starting from scratch, yeah, you do have to plan for that and having a runway even once you've gotten going. And I feel pretty confident that my business is doing pretty well and is going to be around for a while, but I still always am looking at I do 3 months, 6 months is even better. If everything stopped today, could I at least pay myself for 3 months where then I could really hit the ground running and build it back up? That is really key to be able to be successful and not fail and not have those months where you're not being able to put food on your own table or pay your own rent. You don't wanna be in that position.
Yeah, and it's all relative, right? Because look, your 3 months may be way more than my 6 months, depending on what we're paying ourselves, right? And so it's totally all relative. But when you are that S corp, there's just an additional level of scrutiny for the IRS of, you better be paying yourself like a salary. So there's just that added thing for folks to consider. The last thing I want to say about that is I've literally heard my CPA say this in a presentation that he gave to a local networking group. And that is don't feel that you have to when setting up your entity just because you want to pay yourself that salary to get the tax benefit. You don't need to do that right when you get started. You could always change from pass through to S corp. So unless you're like you already have a book of business that's in this well into the six figures, then maybe you can. Context is different. But the takeaway here is not okay. I need to do S corp because that seems to be the tax advantage things to do. Like context matters.
Yeah, and I think for some folks, my understanding is it may actually be detrimental. Like you may pay more in taxes if you take that S corp election too early on. So there's a fine balance. It can be a tightrope to walk. I think working with a professional, like we've said, to really help. Okay, I think you're hitting that threshold. But yeah, in the beginning, I did it for 5 years, somewhere around there, where it was still a pass through. So it's not something you need to do right away. It's not a race to that position. It just made financial sense once I hit a certain threshold that I really should save myself in taxes by doing the S corp election. So just figure out when you get there. It's different for everyone.
I think that about wraps it for the business entity talk. I'm sure we could talk even more about it. There's a lot of tangentially related things, right? Like you put in our show notes, bigger decision might be the name of the entity, which is totally related to choosing your entity. But I feel like that's another conversation.
Yeah. We'll tease folks. Just leave it there.
All right. With that, thanks everybody for tuning in to this. How the heck do I pick a business entity when starting my law firm talk? I don't know. Do you have any better names than that?
No, that's perfect because that's exactly what I thought.
Until next time, with Lauren and Matthew on how to run a law firm in 2025. There you go.
Love it.